Good morning, everyone. This is Tom Taylor and Allison Taylor with Pictures and Stories, and we're here today with our series of webinars on how to save your life in support of the How to Save Your Life book and kit that many of you have purchased, and we appreciate that very much. And in this course, helping you write and complete your life stories, many of you may have got to the point of creating a first draft, or at least we've got up talking about creating a first draft, and this is a major milestone, and congratulate anyone that's got to that point even with a single story. So creating your first draft is very important. Today we're going to talk about editing your first draft, and the way to introduce that is I've taken a picture of Allison in our backyard.
Not really.
She's been doing a little bit of editing. That's how she edits my work. It seems to require a chainsaw.
That is true. I like to cut and slash and burn, and it's kind of fun. Obviously, we're going to be talking today about editing. And but before we get into that, I wanted to go over a little bit of what we talked about last week and writing your stories and getting to the first draft point. And one of the most important principles from the last webinar that I wanted to impress upon you is the essentially the futility of trying to start writing the story of your life at the beginning and then writing it in a chronological manner up to the present day, and how difficult it is to write your story that way. And there's a much easier way to do it, and that is to as we talked about last week, to start with the low-hanging fruit, to look at the story ideas that you've accumulated when you look over your timeline and you've circled the things that you feel are the most important for you to write about, to look over those and just start with the one that just jumps out at you. That is begging to be told first, usually the one that either would be the most fun to write or would be the easiest for you to write, and start there and just write that part of the story and then set it aside and go on to the next and continue this way in a random order, because you'll find the order and the theme at a later point and figure out the order that you want to put your stories in and then do some editing. It's much, much easier for you to write your stories in a random order from the easiest maybe to the hardest, because you get more confident as you go along in the writing process. And it'll sort of warm you up. The easier stories will warm you up and get you ready to tackle maybe the stories that are a little more difficult or more challenging to tell. And we also talked last week about if you're not that crazy about the writing process, some other ways that you can create a narrative for a book of your life. And one thing that we do with our professional clients, people who come to us for help in writing a book, is we will conduct a series of oral interviews with them. And then we will take those interviews, do some cleanup and some editing on them, and use that as a first draft of a narrative, which then our client can look it over and decide what they might want to add, what to change, and do some additional writing there. But it's a really great way to start, even if you like writing. Sometimes even just putting on a recorder and telling your story to another person or to yourself in a room is a great way to get some of just get the stories out there in a really quick and easier way than trying to start off by writing them. So that choice is up to you, but it's something to consider. And Tom has conducted a class called How to Interview Yourself on this topic that basically opens up that possibility of just interviewing yourself, asking yourself questions, or looking at your timeline and talking about those things that are most important to you and just telling them as if you were telling a story to another person. So if the if you find the process of writing really intimidating, you might want to consider that as an option. The first step in beginning to write your stories, after you have looked at your timeline and you've chosen the what you feel are the most important stories to tell, or the things that need to be included in your personal history, you want to take each one of those ideas and flesh it out. Just write notes as much as you can remember about that event or that particular part of your life, just not in full complete sentences or paragraphs. Just start writing down a few words about any details that you can remember. What did it feel like? What did it smell like? What did it sound like? How did other people react to what was going on? What's the background of the story? What else was going on at that time in your life? What historical things were happening during that time period? Just write down, brainstorm everything that you can remember about that one particular incident or one particular story, and just write it all down in notes. We have in our kit story note cards for this purpose. But if you don't have the kit or don't have the note cards, you can use large oversized index cards work really well, or just sheets of paper. It's nice to have loose, whatever it is, have it be loose so that you can shuffle the deck, so to speak, so that you can sort of move around, and try out different orders of possible order of the story before you actually start writing your story. So, and we suggest that you go through all of the things that you've chosen on your timeline, and that you go through all of those first, and then write a story note card for each one of those items. You can also look and see, can some of these items that you circled on your timeline be combined into a single story? Are there really parts of a whole story that you can add together? But we would suggest writing all the story note cards of your stories first before you actually start writing the first draft of any of your stories. Some people, if you're writing out your story note card and you just feel like you really have to write that story right now, you can go ahead and do that. It's kind of up to you, but generally people have more success if they write their story note cards first, get all of those done, or at least most of them done, before they actually start writing or recording any of those stories. It just kind of makes the process a little bit easier, and you feel like you're making progress. Sometimes as you start the writing process, it can be easy to get stuck on one story and trying to perfect that one story too much. Which brings me to the next point that I wanted to impress on you, which we talked about last week as well, is when you start writing your stories, you've got a stack of your story note cards, and you're ready to decide, you're ready to start actually writing them or recording them if you're doing it orally, again, you're going to start with the low-hanging fruit. Pick that story note card that just feels like it would be the easiest or the most fun for you to write or tell, and start there, and just get it all down on the paper. Don't worry about any kind of editing or improving it right now. You're just getting the words on the page. Don't worry about spelling. Don't worry about what your English teacher would think about it if she read it. Don't worry about what your mother or your sister or your father is going to think about it. Don't worry about, at this point, you're not going to worry about whether something you write is going to hurt someone else's feelings. Whatever you need to get on the page about that story, you get it down and just write it, let it come out, and just kind of put everything else aside. And then when you get that story done, that first story, pat yourself on the back, go get a snack, take a hot bath, whatever it is that you can do to reward yourself, because that's a significant achievement, is getting that first story written. And then you're just going to set it aside. You're not going to edit it. You're not going to rework anything at this point. You get it all down on paper, and then you're going to set it aside and pick the next story and do the same thing. The reason that this is so important is that, and we see this happen very often, many times with clients that have come to us who have started writing their stories and they've gotten stuck and they need help to continue, so they will come to us for help. But the reason that you don't want to keep reworking the same story over and over is that it makes it very difficult to keep the momentum going and to move forward to the next story in your writing, because you can get hung up on that one story for a real long time and never move on to the next one. And people get burned out pretty quickly that way. So
I think also the positive value of perspective in time, of just kind of stepping away and getting a new look at it, can be helpful in the editing process.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Just, you need some time, and we'll talk about that in a little bit once you've finished your whole draft, the importance of stepping away from that for a while. The other thing to remember is that when you're writing the first draft of each of these stories, just remember that this is only for you. You're the only one that's going to read this version of the story. So don't edit yourself. Don't worry about what other people are going to think reading this at this point. You will have time to, in the editing process, to go on and revisit some of those things and decide if there are things that you need to cut or things that you need to soften or handle in a more respectful way. And you will have the time to do that. But when you're writing your first draft is not the time for that. You just want to get it all down on a piece of paper. And it's not going to be great. Your first draft of anything is usually, even professional writers, it's not going to be perfect. It's not even going to be that great. But the seeds will be there, and it'll make it much easier for you to keep that momentum going. After you have written all your stories and you've got a nice fat stack of stories of your life that are all completed in their very rough form, now you're going to spread them all out on a big table in front of you, or get them all up on your computer in front of you, so that you can sort of look at your stories overall and say, what sort of order do I want to put these stories in? Do I want to tell my story in a chronological way? And there is absolutely nothing wrong with a chronological narrative, but you don't have to tell your story chronologically if you don't want to. But whatever order makes sense to you, and look and see if, is there an overriding theme that goes across your whole work that creates an arc of the story? Or are you going to organize your stories thematically? That's another thing that works really well sometimes, especially if you're in more of a reminiscent mode, if you're just recalling some of the things that have happened in your life, and you have a lot of things that maybe don't have a big central story, but you're just relating some reminiscences of your life, that you can put those, kind of organize those into themes. Like, you might have a little section about your family, where you talk about your relationship with your parents and your siblings, and then you might talk about maybe your, what you did for fun as a child, and you can talk about your toys or your pets or the things that you did with your friends. You can organize them that way rather than necessarily having a chronological narrative. One thing that we use frequently is a flashback technique, where sometimes it's a great idea to take one sort of dramatic incident from your life, or something in your life that demonstrates the overall theme of your story, and start with that story, even if it's not at the chronological beginning of your life. And then you can, after you tell that story, then you can go back in time and start at an earlier point and move up to the point of that dramatic incident. So there are a number of ways that you can do that. So you're going to put that together in an order that makes sense to you at the time. You can change this order, and you probably will as you go further into the editing process. And also just take a look at that once you've decided on what order your stories are going to go in. Take a look and see, are there some big holes that maybe you need to fill in before you go on to, the first editing process. Is there anything that you've forgotten, or is there a big hole in a period of time that you want to fill in? And do you need to write any transitions between those stories? Are there really, are any of them really abrupt, moving from one to the other, that you might want to write something in between to kind of smooth the reader over from one to the next? So once you have created and put your stories in a relative order and maybe added any big things that are missing, you have your first draft of your narrative completed, and that's a really great feeling to get to that point. And so again, whatever you can do to congratulate yourself when you get that done, go ahead and do it, because it's really a significant achievement. It's not, writing is not the easiest thing in the world, and if you can, but it's also really rewarding, and there's nothing more rewarding than having that feeling of at least getting this first part of it completed. So just take some time. One thing that I think is really important after doing any sort of creative exercise, whether writing, and I worked as an artist and a photographer for many years, and used to, anytime I would finish a piece or finish a great photograph, I would have to put it aside and really not look at it for at least a couple of weeks, and then come back and look at it again. And you get a completely fresh perspective on something that you have created after you do this. Because you get so involved in it, you get, your head is just so much in that area, that you need to sort of step away and go do something else for a while and then come back to it with fresh eyes. That will help you tremendously. So I would suggest that once you finish your first draft, just go put it away and just do something else for a while, and don't try not to think about it. And then as you come back to it, then you'll be looking at it almost as if you were a new person, or for the first time. And you can see more easily what problems you might have. And also, it's really fun when you do put something aside for a while, and then you come back to it and you read it through and you go, hey, that's pretty good. I'm not so bad. And that, I think, happens more often than not, that people are pleasantly surprised by what they have created. Anything you want to add to that, Tom? I'm just hogging the microphone here. Okay, so basically, you're going to do your editing. You're going to edit your first draft in a series of passes. And for purposes of instruction, I've sort of picked the number 3, that you're going to do 3 passes in editing your narrative. But most writers will do more than that. And it just really depends upon how obsessive you are, and what level of perfection you want or need to achieve. But I think, for most people, 3 is enough. Other people may want to do more. Some people don't even want to do 1, which is why they often hire us to do it instead. Yeah, Tom?
Yeah, just back to the point about how important it is getting to your first draft and what an accomplishment that is, and not necessarily having to have something that's perfect. Well, now that you're at your first draft, being able to improve that, this is really an important step, and it's now you can make it better. And really, any professional writer and any really good writer will take it again. And as we started this chapter by saying writing is rewriting, now's the chance to really take and improve that and make it better, by proofing, restructuring, anything to improve that. And so you get to that point of having a first draft being a major accomplishment. Well, well, now is the time to really take and improve that.
Need some water? Okay, so after you've taken your little vacation from your manuscript and you're going to bring it out again, the first thing you want to do is read it through really quickly all at once, as if you were someone in your audience that was reading it for the first time. Don't stop and don't fix any typos, don't change any sentences, don't do any editing at this point. You are just going to read it through really quickly to get the overall gist of it. And just get a big fat red pen, or if you're on your computer, use the highlighting tool in your word processing program, whatever you need to do, but just start marking things, big things that may be a problem, things that maybe don't make sense, or things that you may have left out, things that you've repeated. This is something that we see often, where people have written a manuscript and they bring it to us for layout, and as we're looking through it before we begin the layout, we realize that they've told the same story 2 different times in 2 different chapters. And that's something that sometimes it takes another pair of eyes to even recognize that you've done that. But those are the kind of things that you're looking for. Have I repeated myself here? Have I told this story more than once? Is there, just make a big red line around or highlight those areas that just kind of aren't working, or that, any big major problems that you have. And look for things that, look for things that you can cut, especially if you feel like your manuscript has gotten a little lengthier than you want it to be. And one thing I'll just say about that is that it's much easier to write something that's short and concise. Scratch that. I got that backwards. It's much harder to write something that's short and concise than it is to write something long, because I think many people's manuscripts end up being longer than they need to be. They have repetitive information. They have maybe some detail that's not really that interesting, or have things that in their book that maybe doesn't really tell the story of their lives as well as some other things in their life could. So you just want to, you're looking for the big problems in this first pass, and read it as if somebody else were reading it. Don't worry about the little details at this point, but just look for obvious problems.
And just to add on that, I think may have already been said, but it's just, this is a higher level edit where you're looking at content and concept, and are you making the point that you wanted to make? Are you maybe conveying the feeling and the lesson that you want to convey, rather than just editing spelling and words and commas and flow? You want to take that higher level up and say, am I really getting at the feeling and story that I want to convey here? So it's at a higher level, a concept level. Right.
Roy Peter Clark, who wrote the book Writing Tools, which is a book on writing that we highly recommend, one of 2, which I put them in the slides this time so you can have that for reference, but both excellent books. Roy Peter Clark says, begin by pruning the big limbs. You can shake out the dead leaves later. So at this point in this first pass, you are doing just the big pruning, cutting out things that are obviously not going to work, figuring out what you may have left off that needs to be added in, circling things that don't make sense that you need to clarify, those kind of big problems. Look at, during this first pass, are these stories, are they, I think, you know what, I've got a duplicate slide here, so I'm just going to go on to the next one. Okay. Does this story have a point? Why am I telling this story? Is this going to be interesting to my audience who's going to read it? Will this be interesting to someone, 50 or 100 years from now? Will it interest the people who are going to be reading it now? Does it make sense? Do I need to, is it confusing? Do I need to clarify the way that I tell this story to make it more compelling for the reader? Is it repetitive? Are there things that have I already said this? Do I need to take that out? If you come across something that doesn't really have a point, maybe it's just sort of a random reminiscence. Sometimes, reminiscences can be fine, especially you don't want to just have all sort of vague reminiscences with no actual core of a story. But if you can weave reminiscences around these stories, that will make the whole thing much more interesting. But if you find some reminiscence of something and it doesn't really have a point to it, but it's still really interesting, that it shows, where you were in history, or it really shows the reader and shows the reader, not just tells the reader, what your life was like at that point in time, then, and even if it doesn't have, a beginning, middle, and end, and a plot, and a struggle, and all those things that make up the story, you can still leave it in there if it's interesting. But if it doesn't have a point and it's kind of boring, just cut it out, because it's just going to add fluff to your story that will get in the way of you telling the best story that you want to tell. So if you're a couple of weeks ago, we gave an example of someone describing the house that they grew up in. And, make sure that there's some emotion in there. How did you feel about that house? What kinds of activities did you do there? And what was the overall tone of the place where you lived? And if you're just describing how much you paid for it and where you bought your furniture and, how the square footage of each room, that's stuff that is probably not going to be very interesting to someone either now or years down the road. So either change it to make it more interesting or just cut it out. After you've gone through the first time, and now you're ready to go back and take a closer look at some of the things to see if there's anything that you want to change, kind of more major things that you want to change. You're not getting to the point of proofreading or word for word sentence structure at this point, but mostly your second pass. Again, it's probably a good idea to set it aside for a little while between your first pass and your second pass. Again, anytime you can do that, it'll just give you a little more fresh perspective on it. But especially in the second pass, take a look at anything that might be sensitive to other people. This is the time when you want to read it as if somebody else were reading it and say, okay, is this person, I'm writing about my father in this point. If my father reads this, are his feelings going to be hurt? Will he take exception to this? And I'm not saying that if his feelings are going to be hurt, or if if someone might be offended by this, it doesn't necessarily mean that you should automatically take it out because of that. Sometimes we need to say difficult things, and sometimes no matter what we say, someone will have trouble with it. And this is your story, and you're not going to be able to please everybody. But look at it. Examine, is there something you need to tone down? Do you need to explain a situation in a more compassionate way or in a more direct way? As long as you are telling the truth or your version of the truth, then sometimes you just need to say what you need to say and not be concerned about how others are going to react to it. That being said, handling those kind of family skeletons, or handling even just disagreements between family members on how something might happen. Everybody has a different version of every story. And sometimes that in itself can be entertaining to say in your story, well, I remember it this way, even though my brother remembers it this way and my sister remembers it some completely different way. But this is how I remember it happening. It's totally legitimate for you to say that.
Yeah, and she may well get to this, but also it's going back to your purpose as to why are you telling this story. And some stories maybe don't need to be told. And so you have to look and say, what are the most important things you want to convey, and why are you doing this? If it's done just to hurt someone, you have to say, is that my motive? Is that really something I want to do and spend my time? It's nice to get it out sometimes on that that draft on that paper and then take and crumple it up and throw it away and say, well, I've spent my time with that, and I'm going to go on to something more worthwhile or valuable or more fitting within what your purposes are.
Thanks. You need to make sure that you yourself are going to be protected, that you're not going to end up being sued by somebody that you mentioned in your story. And as much as you can, it's just the classier thing to try to be respectful of someone else's, at least someone else's privacy, if not their feelings. And sometimes this can be accomplished by changing the names and details of the story. Sometimes that's not possible. I mean, if you're telling the story of your own life story and you're talking about your father, it's pretty hard to, change your father's name and not have people still know who that is. But if there's a way that you can change the names or details, even tell something in a fictional way, might be a good way to tell a sensitive story. Most of the time, in most of the manuscripts that we look at in people's life stories, when they are dealing with the difficult questions, usually things can be handled just by a simple rephrasing of a sentence, or just finding a way to rephrase something so that it's more respectful or that a little more compassionate. And usually that's all that's needed to soften something enough so that you can get your point across without being offensive. Sometimes you need to take things out altogether, and different people have different levels of comfort with this issue. I know we worked quite closely with a man who was telling the story of his life, and his mother had some significant issues with mental illness, and it was really difficult for him. We felt that for him to tell some of the stories of his relationship with his mother and some of the difficulties involved in that, we felt that it was important for his children to understand some of those things that had happened, because that would help them to understand him and where he came from and what kind of environment he grew up in, and would help to understand some of his, his personality and where that came from. However, he was very uncomfortable with leaving some of those events with his mother in the story, because he felt that he was being disrespectful to her by mentioning them, even though she had already passed away, that he was somehow besmirching her memory by revealing those things. So ultimately he chose to leave them out. And I am not judging one way or the other. It's totally up to you and how you handle those issues. Sometimes I think, we don't want to whitewash the story, certainly. We don't want to try to make ourselves look like everything was just hunky-dory our whole lives, because that's a boring story and it doesn't help anyone. What helps other people in reading our stories is to see how they overcame, how did we overcome situations? How did we get through the tough parts of life? But also, you have to take into account your own comfort level in how you're going to portray this story and how that will affect the others in your lives. Just lastly, I'll just say that just make sure that you're telling your own story. As I said, if your sister has a different version of events, then she can write her version of the story if she wants to. But this is your story, and it's fair for you to tell it in how you remember and in your own words, and not necessarily how what your sister or your children or your friends think happened. So stay true to yourself when you're doing that.
Just back here, just editing is the chance for you to make it better, to do a favor to your reader, to give them something that's going to be valuable in the things that you've learned and share. And and editing, as we've said, takes some time. Read it over, write it, read it over, and then come back and say, is this really what I want to communicate? Is this what they need to know? And it really comes back to that purpose of how you want them to feel, what you want them to know, what would be really helpful in telling this story. What's the purpose? What's the point? And come back and consider those things as you edit.
Absolutely. Okay, so now you've gone through a second time and you've looked at any issues that might be sensitive, and you've sort of fixed some things in the story maybe that will make it make sense more. You've taken out some repetitive things. You've kind of gone through that. So you have a draft now that's still a little bit rough, but it's in much better shape than it was. So now you're going to do another pass and just look at more of the details. You're going to focus in to individual sentences, individual details, and see if they're the best that they can be. So the first thing to look at might be your detail, how much detail you're providing in your story, and maybe you need to provide more detail to actually bring the reader, like paint a mental picture in the reader's head, so that they can actually see what you are, what you're talking about, and not just reading, words that tell them about it. You want to actually show them what that looked like, what that felt like. And are you using unnecessary words? Almost all of us, myself included, can benefit from tightening up our writing and getting rid of words that aren't necessary, making the sentences as clear and concise as possible. And that usually means that you're just going to make it simpler. Just adding more words or adding bigger words doesn't necessarily make you look smarter or make your writing better, and usually it makes it worse. The simpler you can say something, the better, and the clearer that's going to come across to the reader. And that doesn't mean that you're going to cut out descriptive detail. It just means that if there's unnecessary words, like using words like very or occasionally, or really is one we see a lot. Something is really, really something. It's really, really dark. All you have to do is say that it's dark, and people will get the idea. I put up on the screen, this is 2 pages out of William Zinsser's book on writing well, which is the other book that we highly recommend just for basic writing techniques and how to improve your writing. Both really excellent and really accessible books, easy to read and very helpful. But this is a page where he shows the editing process, and he says this is actually maybe his 5th or 6th draft that he got to this point. And we're certainly not saying that you need to do 5 or 6 editing passes of your story. That's up to you. But just to show that even a professional writer who writes every day and teaches writing still goes through and says, okay, I'm using a lot of words here, obviously, that I don't need to use. And so he's constantly trying to increase the simplicity of his sentences. Obviously, we don't have time to read through and break this down word for word, but it's an interesting thing to look at if you want to get the book, or if you want to look at the recorded webinar and really read through this and break it down. It gives you some really good suggestions of what types of words, unnecessary words, that we all use, and how much better your writing can be if you just cut some of those out. Another thing is, again, look at your detail. Are the details that you're telling interesting? Are you giving enough detail? Are you showing the person what it was like? I gave this example a couple of webinars ago. You can say that your father was frugal, or you can show with words what that looked like to see your father, and an example of his frugality is going to be more interesting than just saying that, my dad was really tall. Well, how tall was he? Did he scrape his head on the door jamb as he walked through the door? How do you show that to your reader? Again, just really quickly, try to avoid using passive voice where things are acted upon rather than acting. An example here, the entire pie was eaten by my sister. It's much stronger to say, my sister ate the pie. So there's a subject and there's a verb, and the subject is doing the verb rather than the verb happening on its own by some unnamed person or thing. That will make your writing stronger. Alfred Hitchcock, drama is life with the dull bits cut out. So this is the pass, this final pass that you want to look in and say, okay, are there any dull bits in here that I should just get rid of? And what's left should be the drama and the meat and the laughter and the entertainment and the rich description of your story and your life. Just end, well, almost end. Got a few more slides here, but this is a favorite poem by Dr. Seuss. It has often been said, there's so much to be read. You never can cram all those words in your head. So the writer who breathes more words than he needs is making a chore for the reader who reads. That's why my belief is the briefer the brief is, the greater the sigh of the reader's relief is. And that's why your books have such power and strength. You publish with short. Short is better than length. So just keep this in mind as you are telling your story. Again, it's much harder to put forth something that is shorter and concise. It's much easier to just take a whole bunch of stuff from your journals and a whole bunch of other stories from other places and throw them all together into a book and not even, go through it and look at it closely. And I've known people that have done that, and it's still better than not doing anything. But if you can tighten that up and shorten it and make it more palatable for your reader, it's going to be that much more enjoyed by your audience. Just a few last things about the editing process. Read it out loud to yourself. That will give you a different perspective on it. It can show you if some of your sentences sound a little sing-songy, if they sort of get into a rhythm that might be sort of putting you to sleep as you're reading it. You might want to vary some of your length of your sentences, or maybe turn some of your sentences into a question. Is there some way that you can spruce it up a little bit? Also, I think at this point, it's good to maybe have somebody else read it just to get their perspective on it. But make sure that that's somebody that you really trust. Make sure that it's somebody that maybe is objective about your life, who's not, a close person in your life, or not someone that's going to be mentioned in the book. Although that can also be helpful. You may want to have the people who are in your book read it to see if there's anything that they're going to be offended by or that's going to cause problems in the family. That's up to you. But don't have your, if you have a very critical friend who you love but who kind of puts you down often and is also an aspiring writer, don't give it to that person to read, because it's just going to be maybe too crushing to your ego. So have somebody that you really trust who has pure motivations read your book and give you some honest criticism and honest feedback. And we don't need to say how important proofreading is, but actually you need to have a human being other than yourself read through the final draft of your book before you start doing the layout. Otherwise, you may find that you have something in here that passes a spell check and that your eyes can easily gloss over, but that really doesn't get across the point that you're trying to say. So you're going to look at this and make sure that you find those things before you go to print, and you'll save yourself a lot of hassle there, because you want to engage your posterity and not enrage your posterity. Also, if there's one other thing I can impress upon you today, and that is to make sure that your manuscript is finished before you start trying to add any pictures to it or before you start the layout process. You do not, trust me, you do not want to be changing the order of chapters and taking out or adding in, full paragraphs or pages of information after you've already put your pictures in, because you're just going to create a nightmare for yourself. And it will make the process longer and more expensive. So make sure that you like your narrative the way it is. It doesn't mean that once you put your pictures in that you can't go in and make some minor editing changes or fix some typos or punctuation and that kind of thing. You can, but the more your narrative is finished before you get to that point, the happier your life is going to be. And the last thing I just want to say is that when your story is good enough, let it go. It's never going to be perfect, and you will always find something after your book is printed that you will wish that you had changed, but that's just the nature of the beast. You can always, do supplementary, make a supplementary book later. You can always add more volumes or more experiences in your life at a later date, but just get something out there for people to see. Over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about photos and how to prepare your photos for layout and some different options that you have in laying out a book and printing and publishing. We'll be talking about that over the next couple of weeks, and we appreciate you being with us today. I'm going to open the time up for some questions now. We've muted the microphones because we have had some feedback trouble with that. So if you have a question, please go ahead and type it into your scanning box. There's a couple of questions here that we talked about last week that don't have anything to do with the writing process, but we were talking a little bit on scanning, and we were talking about should you use your scanning driver to make corrections in your scans and to improve your photos, or should you just scan them raw and then fix your photos in Photoshop or some other photo editing software later. And Joan says that it turned out that she thought that using the scanning photo editing software created nicer photos. So that's good to know. And my advice was to just do some tests on your own scans. Maybe scan when you're scanning your photos. Try your scanner driver's automatic correction tools and see what the results are, and if you have good results with that, go ahead and use that. But if you sometimes you have more finer control of detail if you just scan the raw file and then go into Photoshop and make changes there. You have a little more control over it. But sometimes if you have a scanner driver that works well for that, then go ahead and use it, because it will save you some time and effort. Any other questions about this editing process or anything that you run across in your writing?
There's someone what recorder to use, I think.
Let's see. Oh, okay. Sorry, I missed one. A question from Bev. I'm looking for a recommendation for a digital voice recorder that I can use to record voices and load them onto my computer to share that with other relatives. Do you have any suggestions for a recorder? I will hand that over to Tom, because he's the guy that knows about those things.
There's lots of different kinds of recorders to use. I use an Olympus recorder. I found those really great. The one I use is called an Olympus LS7. Great little recorder. I've found that handy as can be. Sony makes a series of very fine voice recorders. You're looking at, you can get a good recorder for $50, and you may be going $200 or maybe even more. The key that you want to find is something that's easy for you, that gives you the voice quality that you are looking for your needs, and that interfaces with your computer so you can get those in. I think one of the very best suggestions is to get something that works with your smartphone if you have a smartphone, and many of us do now, whether that be an iPhone or an Android device. Within the abilities of your smartphone, you can either have a free app or an app that may cost $3 or $4 that gives you terrific ability to record quality interviews that can be used in creating a life story. One of the things that you'll want to consider is how good the microphone should be. And you can get an external microphone for an electronic device, or that you can plug in separately, or some of these Sony, Olympus, other ones have a built-in microphone. And the microphone can be important if you're going to use the recording later, not just for getting the story and writing that down, but actually saving that recording to be used at a later time. And where you place the device, including particularly the microphone, close to the speaker's mouth, so that you can pick up that person without someone typing something on a computer, or fans going, or whatever the noise may be in the background, to where you can get a clean, clear recording of the person's voice. So it's really a matter of finding something that works for you. Again, I use the Olympus. I've used Sony's, and they're very nice. And I also use devices on my smartphone. I find them all to be very effective, but have something that you can have with you that's available when you need it.
And just make sure that whatever you use, that you have battery power, because there's nothing worse than having an opportunity to do a great interview, with a grandparent or someone, and then your battery goes dead, or your phone runs out of battery, and you don't have any way to record that. So make sure that you're always prepared that way. A couple of other questions. I did post my email address, allison@picturesandstories.com. If you would like to see any of the previous webinars or a recording of this one, go ahead and email me, and I will send you the links where you can find those. They are on an unlisted YouTube channel, but we can give you the links for that. Tina asks, is it possible to make an ebook to share? Absolutely. And that's something we'll talk a little bit about in a couple of weeks as one of the options that you can do. One thing that I'll just throw out there right now is that there's so many ways that you can digitally share your stories and your pictures with people now, and that's just a terrific thing, and I think everybody should take advantage of that. But also, when people say, well, should I do it digitally, should I do an ebook, or should I do a printed book? And the thing is, I think the answer is always both, and we're not saying that just because we happen to design, and help people print books, but that I think it's really important to have take full advantage of both opportunities. Books, even though we hear people talk about the end of books, that the printed book is going away, and I think in a lot of instances that's true. I think when it comes to novels or things that don't include that many pictures and are not, where the visual content is not that important, ebooks make a whole lot of sense, and certainly to share and to make those available to other people, and just for the sheer portability. There's a lot of really good reasons to share your information digitally. But there's nothing like having an actual printed book, especially if you are including visual material, photos, and other kinds of things. And there's the immediacy of an actual printed book that is really important. We have clients that we make books they're lovely and attractive, and that you want to have out on your coffee table, that you want to actually have them displayed and enjoyed frequently, and not just shoved on a bookshelf or in a box in the basement somewhere. And that should be your goal, because there's nothing like having, we have clients who have their books out on their coffee tables, and that's something that anybody that drops by their house will sit and have a look at it and engage with that book, where if it's just in an electronic format, they're not going to be able to engage with it, as casually as that. And also, I think books are not going away. Every time we go to the bookstore, it's still packed. I mean, there are tons of people in there, and people are still buying books. But one thing I've noticed about there's sort of been a visual revolution in books now, is that the book design is becoming much more important. So people are still willing to engage with books, but they're becoming much more visual. And another interesting thing that I see is a lot of these things that are just strictly online, online phenomena now they're making book versions of them and selling them in the bookstore. I saw a Grumpy Cat book the other day, that was just full of grumpy cat memes that have been circulated on Facebook and Pinterest and all of those things, and people are taking those images and putting them into books. And so people are just as interested in engaging with the printed form. But also, if you're going to go to all the trouble of writing your stories, putting them into a book, designing them, putting them in a nice design with some photographs, once you have all that work done, you also can take that information and put it in a digital format that can be shared with people that aren't going to be able to access your printed book. So the answer is both are good, both are equally important, and if you're going to the work to do one, you might as well do the other as well. And then you'll have something that that you can put on a coffee table, that looks visually beautiful, that you can hand down to people, that doesn't need it's not ever going to be obsolete. It won't need any particular software to look at it on, but also you'll be able to share it with a wider audience. Anything?
Yeah, I think well said, and it's just a matter of consider your reader. What's going to be the way that you can get these words into their use? How's it going to be effective and useful for them? And that's why editing comes in. It's considering a reader. How can you do the favor to them and make this something that's as polished as you want it to be and clean and ready, but it's something that can really help convey the thoughts that you want to share with them.
I think we're about out of time. Thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate your support. If you are interested in the How to Save Your Life One Chapter at a Time book and kit, you can find that either on our website at picturesandstories.com or at howtosaveyourlifeinabook.com. And if you're interested in the kit, if you don't already have it and would like to purchase it, I can give you a discount code where you can get the kit for $99. And if you email me, I will send you the code to get that if you're interested. And if anybody has any additional questions, feel free to email me and I'd be happy